As a Gaza ceasefire remains elusive, has a small glimmer of hope dimmed again. Talks in Israel, Egypt, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia have failed to deliver. But Hamas says it is now reviewing an Israeli proposal in a positive spirit. With more than 30,000 killed and an assault on Rafah still planned, could another meeting in Cairo finally bring relief to Gazans? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is a ceasefire in Gaza. Well, U.S. officials claim to be determined to deliver a ceasefire, but after 7 months, there's been no respite from Israel's assault on Gaza. After visiting the region this week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned of a last chance for Hamas to accept an Israeli proposal. That proposal involves a 40-day ceasefire and the release of Palestinian prisoners in return for hostages held by Hamas. Blinken describes the deal as generous.
Israel has made very important compromises in the proposal that's on the table, demonstrating its desire and willingness to get this agreement and get it done. Now, as we've been saying, it's on Hamas. Hamas has to decide whether it will take this deal and actually advance the situation for the people that it purports to care about in Gaza. There is no time for delay. There's no time for further haggling. The deal is there. They should take it.
But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also said an invasion of Rafah, where over half of Gaza's population are taking shelter, would still go ahead after the proposed ceasefire ends. And even while the negotiations took place, Israeli forces began preparations for a Rafah invasion, threatening a deadline of 72 hours if no ceasefire deal is reached.
All the Palestinians from Gaza gathered in the city of Rafah, and only a small blow remains to get them all out. Then it would be the biggest disaster in the history of the Palestinian people. We appeal to the United States of America to ask Israel to stop the Rafah operation, because America is the only country capable of preventing Israel from committing this crime.
So as Israel prepares for a fresh ground offensive, it would seem Blinken's shuttle diplomacy is failing. Gaza remains under heavy bombardment, with the death toll nearing 35,000. And for those who've survived, the war has led to a humanitarian catastrophe with nowhere near enough food, water, or medical supplies entering Gaza. Plus, with infrastructure destroyed, a lack of basic hygiene is threatening thousands more innocent lives.
The situation is unbearable in this place because there is sewage here, and this wastewater affects the residents directly from diseases, especially children and women, allergies and abdominal pain. This affects all of us and has a negative effect on everyone.
So, is a ceasefire within reach? And if not, how long can Gaza survive? Well, joining me now to discuss that are in the studio TRT World's Gaza correspondent, Nizar Sadawi. From Boston, distinguished public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, Rami Khouri. In London, associate fellow at Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, Yossi Mekelberg. And finally, Palestinian-American political analyst Omar Baddar joins us from Washington. Thanks all so much for being with me. Rami, I'll start with you. If there is hope for a ceasefire, it's because you believe Israel has made certain concessions here that weren't on the table before. So explain what got them to this point and why it could be a unique opportunity for Hamas.
It's a unique opportunity for the whole Middle East, the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the whole world, really. Both sides have made some concessions and shown some pragmatism, but the Israelis are probably the ones who made the biggest concessions. And this is typical. It's happened after rounds of fighting in Lebanon with Hezbollah and others. Israel's mighty military force that destroys and kills on an industrial scale cannot resolve political problems. Those need political agreements. And in the end, Israel does things it says it would never do. It makes ceasefires. It withdraws from occupied lands. It exchanges prisoners. It does all kinds of things that it said it would never do, and this is a sign of how people negotiate. We should, applaud that in a way. But the reality is that the concessions that the Israelis are making are nowhere near what is required by, first of all, international law, second of all, a Palestinian consensus to go ahead. So the pressures on the Israelis are intense, on Netanyahu especially and his government, from the U.S., from internal society, and from the region.
Well, let me ask Yossi if you agree with Rami there, and how much pressure is Netanyahu under to make this happen now? Because there are others that argue it's actually just in his best interest to prolong this war because he can't survive politically anyway.
Well, that's the big question. What Netanyahu thinks, whether he can survive or not. In his mind, he can survive as long as the war continues, as long as he can still tell the story that he can destroy and Israel can destroy Hamas. And there is an end game in that Hamas is no more. And his political career, even survival vis-a-vis his corruption trial and the war are now tied together, which makes it always dangerous. On the other hand, I agree with Rami. I think the pressure is mounting, and we see day in, day out demonstration in Israel. And those are not only the protesters that protested before against the judiciary so-called reform, which basically was an assault on the Israeli democracy. Those are the protesters that want to see the release of the hostages. Many of them want to see the war over and also to investigate how Israel ended in this situation, how October 7 happened, how the war was conducted, how Israel happens to find itself by the end of it in front of the ICJ, no victory in Gaza, and isolated internationally.
Okay. Let me bring it back to the studio. Nizar, I'll ask you, given this pressure, help us understand why or if Hamas would actually negotiate here, especially when Netanyahu has said from the beginning, the deal is, okay, give us the only leverage we have. So give us back our hostages. Oh, and by the way, we're still going to kill you. That is what I promised the Israeli people we will do, and that's what I'm going to make happen. So why would Hamas really be interested in negotiating on these terms?
Because when it comes to Hamas, Andrea, the pressure is not coming from the U.S. itself, regardless of what the U.S. continues to say. The only pressure actually present when it comes to Hamas is the increase in the number of casualties, the increase of the losses inside the Gazan enclave. And that's why these negotiations have continued to fail repeatedly. I mean, there have been so many proposals and counter-proposals going back and forth, delegations, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey is now involved, so many mediators, but it has led to nothing because of the cost that Hamas is expected to pay when it comes to the, of course, other parties like Israel, for example, backed, of course, by the United States government. Now, it's all about the post-war Gaza. How would Gaza look like after the war ends? Because eventually the war will end. They do realize that, both Hamas and Israel. And whoever will be in charge of ruling or governing Gaza after the war is what matters. Hamas needs to be present. Hamas continues to insist that even if they don't want to stay in control fully of Gaza, but at least they need to be part of that future government. And the main argument is that this is an internal Palestinian issue.
Okay. Omar, I'd like to get your thoughts on that then. I mean, Hamas does still see some kind of role for itself. That is a major, obviously, saying this a sticking point kind of understates it, but major sticking point for Israel. So where do you see these negotiations going? Are you just optimistic?
Look, Andrea, the fundamental problem here is that Israel set unrealistic expectations. If I had just come out at the very beginning and said the goal of this campaign is to cause massive destruction all over Gaza and to mass slaughter the civilian population, nobody could stop Israel from achieving these things. So they could have claimed mission accomplished in a way and then negotiated that exchange where they release the Palestinian prisoners and hostages they're holding in exchange for Israeli prisoners. But instead, what they chose to do is actually say that we're going to defeat Hamas completely and retrieve the hostages by force. And when you set unrealistic goals, Israel finds itself now in a position where Netanyahu is desperate to produce some kind of image of a success. And in the absence of that, there is simply no way for him politically to kind of just end this massive slaughter and to call it a day, primarily because he's really concerned about himself, his own, not just political survival, but his legacy at this point, the person on whose watch something as massive as October 7th has happened, in which the entire world has turned on Israel because of Israel's insane atrocities and genocidal violence in Gaza. He's looking for a way out, and there simply isn't a way out. And that's precisely why we're stuck in a situation where it's quite difficult to imagine what's the compromise point at which a ceasefire is going to be forced. It is one of those situations where the world has to intervene, has to apply significant pressure, has to say that this is beyond what Netanyahu thinks about his own personal political survival and career and reputation and so on, and to say we just have to put an end to the slaughter. It needs to come to an end now. That's the only way that anything is going to change, is under much more intense pressure than we've seen so far.
Omar, I also have to ask you quickly from Washington, how is this now playing out in the United States? You know, in combination with the student protests, how much pressure is the administration really under right now?
Oh, pretty significant pressure here domestically. It's quite clear that the majority of Americans support an end to the slaughter. The opinion polls show it. And when you look at President Biden's own base, it's even much higher than that. It's really overwhelming what the population actually wants. And we see it reflected in those mass protests that are taking place on campuses from coast to coast. Those are the conscience of this country, who are demanding an end to the slaughter and an end to American weapons and support for this for these massacres that are being committed. And so the administration is under intense pressure, in part because we have an election coming up, and this is very seriously compromising President Biden's re-election chances. There would have been practically no chance that Trump could ever beat Biden, given what the last election was like, and given the fact that Trump has much more significant legal troubles right now. The only reason why this is still a competitive race is because Biden is insisting on continuing long-standing American policy of saying that Israel is a country that is above the law and above any rules and gets to do whatever it wants. And that does not sit well with a younger American generation that is much more educated, much more informed about the dynamics in the Middle East and the scale of Israeli atrocities and beyond just Gaza, just really long-standing Israeli apartheid. And they're not putting up with it. And that's really bringing things to a head here within the United States.
Wow. Rami, I'll come back to you, because you've said Israel is isolated in many ways, but Hamas, you've said, is also isolated because of the support for the Palestinian people. They have the support, but Hamas does not necessarily have the support that it wanted or was expecting from its Arab and Muslim fellow Arab and Islamic countries. Is this true? Do you think that is a point that forces Hamas's position at this time?
A little bit. I think Hamas is under intense pressure for many reasons. It did anticipate and hope for more direct military and explicit political diplomatic support from Arab and Islamic countries, and it didn't get it. It got a little bit from Hezbollah and others, but and Ansarullah in Yemen. So that's an issue for them. They are also up and down in terms of Palestinian public opinion. They've raised their popularity in the Arab world recently because of the situation, but that'll go back down again. Historically, Islamist movements have not been leaders in Palestinian public opinion. They've been leaders in Palestinian social policy, community development, and things like that. The problem is the Palestinians have no government. The Palestinian Authority and the PLO are relics of the past, and they have no credibility. And the Palestinians are divided partly by Israeli intentions into different 4 or 5 different fields. Hamas is the only group now that embodies what has been a process for Palestinians for the last 50 years, which is that military resistance is the only way that you can force Israel to negotiate, but military resistance is a tool to reach a political resolution. The Palestinians want to, and they've accepted to live with Israel, including Hamas very explicitly, and that's what they want to reach. But Hamas goes up and down, they know that, and I'm ready to bet a double falafel sandwich with hot sauce that at some point down the road in the next 6-9 months, we're going to see the U.S. negotiating with Hamas. In the same way it negotiated with the Viet Cong and the Taliban and all the people that have said it, and the PLO once, the people said it would never talk to them, they're terrorists, and then it negotiates with them. Because Hamas reflects a political sentiment that is national in scope and reasonable in intent, the intent being coexistence with Israeli and Palestinian states side by side if the Palestinians get their rights. So This is the situation.
Let me ask Yossi then where Israel might stand on that. If that becomes a prospect in these talks, that somehow the U.S. will have to look at Hamas across the table and speak seriously about a longer-term solution. Is it possible? I don't think it is if Netanyahu is in office, but many see Netanyahu's time, his days are very limited. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I think one of the things is we should avoid the binary approach to all of this. Is this or the other? I think instead of looking whether it's Hamas is the partner, is the PLO the partner, is Netanyahu partner, I say we look to see what we actually want to achieve, how we bring this conflict to an end, how we manage to achieve two-state solution, how we ensure that everyone, the Palestinians and Israel live in security, have the same rights. And I think we start with dealing with the politics of it instead of the values and the political objective. Even beyond Netanyahu, of course, won't negotiate with Hamas. But to be honest, at this point, I don't see almost anyone in the Israeli political system, if they want to survive in Israel politics and be in government, that will negotiate with Hamas. So Hamas, and I agree with that, part of the Palestinian society and the political landscape in Palestine, but direct negotiations with Hamas, I think we are not there yet. Yeah. I think we need to work few stages to end the war, to get to a ceasefire, the reconstruction, changing government in Israel, election in Palestine, and then we can move on to look at how we resolve the conflict altogether.
Okay, but then Yossi, if you can enlighten us, if you can, on not what Netanyahu's take is right now, but what the general Israeli public's take is on the end game for all of this. Where do they see Gaza? What does the Israeli public want for Gaza in majority terms? Let's put it that way.
I think the trauma of October 7 led many to believe in Israel that there was a real possibility to destroy Hamas, to take out of completely the equation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think this is still strong.
But what about for Gaza itself? They can take, if they believe they can somehow take Hamas out of the equation, that's one thing. But I'm talking about the 2 million people, well, fewer now, but those millions of people that live on their border that have been displaced and whose land has been completely destroyed, catastrophically so. What do they think is supposed to happen to that piece of land and their neighbors?
This is a great question, but if you look at the answers, when you ask people in Israel, they don't have an answer. They went to this war not with a strategy, with objectives that are achievable, but when red mist, when with rage, with want to avenging, and this is not a way to conduct war. And as a result of it, so many looked at Palestinians and civilians as collateral damage, which obviously is not the way to look at it. There was no exit strategy. There is no idea what's going to happen. And the government really led many people to believe that it's possible to destroy Hamas, and then we'll see what happens, which of course wrong. But right now, I haven't heard about any plan which can be implementable plan, what to do with Gaza after the war. And this is missing. Now, outside Israel, there are ideas, and those should be, at the end of the day, the one that negotiated and implemented.
Okay. Nizar, how do Gazans answer that question? Where do they see the end game here? I mean, who's supposed to rebuild for them, for example? And how is that going to be worked into an agreement? Because right now, not only are they displaced, but like I said, their infrastructure, there's nothing there in so much of this territory.
Of course. Look, by all means, what happened in Gaza was an absolute catastrophe. And what makes it worse, especially for Gazans themselves, is the realization that there is no end game until this moment. It's not just about the negotiations, it's not about politics, because it goes way beyond this. They understand that after each of the many escalations that they have lived through, nothing changed in terms of politics. This is what matters for Palestinians. I mean, there were times when two-state solutions was, an option being discussed. There was a time in history where they even discussed a one-state solution, but it doesn't seem that there is an actual partner in these negotiations. And by the way, the funny part is that this is the same argument that Israelis themselves have been saying. They have been blaming President Abbas, for example, saying that he cannot stand as an actual partner in the peace process. And this is what President Abbas says about Benjamin Netanyahu. So the same thing. This is an ever-ending cycle. For the people of Gaza themselves, what they want is a more conclusive solution. By the way, I just came from there, and I can definitely say that they no longer think about what's going to happen the day after the war. Right. They want a more conclusive idea of how their life would look like. They need a more sustainable solution, because if this war ends, and it will again, but what guarantees that the fighting will not return? Not just because of the fact that Israel continues to discuss a pause on hostilities instead of a permanent ceasefire, but because there are no guarantees that this war will not happen again, maybe in a year, maybe in 5. They want something concrete, and that has not been achieved, not through politics and not through ground offensives.
All right. And I mean, if that's the prospect, Omar, what's the end game for Gaza if nothing's left? If there's even the potential to return back to this war in full force, even after a ceasefire is negotiated, what is there for Gazans? And then whom can they even look to rebuild, to help bring some kind of form of statehood, back to the territory itself?
Yeah, Gaza will never be the same again. I mean, the scale of the destruction, it's difficult to imagine what it would take, even if you physically rebuild the place, which would take an enormous amount of time and money and investment. Just the trauma that the population has suffered. I mean, that's a piece of land that will never, ever be the same again. But it really comes down to something more fundamental. We're talking about Israeli attitudes here. And the truth is, the Israeli political spectrum, the entire political spectrum, does not want Palestinians to have their own state in which they can be free, and does not want to grant them full rights under Israeli control. And so effectively, what the Israeli political establishment is demanding from end to end is that Palestinians remain an occupied population until the end of time, or else they can just go away if they don't want to live that way. And the extent to which that there is tension within the Israeli political spectrum, it's the Netanyahu-Ben Gvir wing that we're seeing, which wants to do that through the mass slaughter and mass violence to impose harsh conditions that Palestinians are forced to accept against their will, versus people who think that you can do the occupation a little bit more humanely, that you would not recognize Palestinians as human beings who deserve to have full rights, but hey, maybe we can make the occupation a little bit better, make it a little bit easier for them. And the truth is, none of this is going to work, because no people anywhere in the world would accept to live without rights. Palestinians deserve to be free. And the reason why the Israeli political spectrum does not allow that to happen is because Washington has provided endless impunity for Israel, allowed Israel to abuse Palestinians day in and day out for year after year without ever facing any consequences. Unconditional military funding. Every time somebody goes to the UN, the US steps in and vetoes any UN resolution that's trying to hold Israel accountable. You can see it with the US pressure on the ICC whenever they try to hold individual Israeli war criminals accountable for the atrocities they've committed against Palestinians. Time and again, Washington's role has been to prevent any accountability for Israel. And as long as Israel does not face any accountability, it is always going to be a rejectionist political entity that has no interest in seeing Palestinians as real people, and therefore incapable of actually ending the conflict. What we need is precisely what we saw in South Africa during the apartheid era, is that the world came together to isolate the apartheid government and say, we're not going to deal with you until the apartheid system ends. And that is precisely what is called for here, is that as long as Israel practices apartheid and refuses to grant Palestinians any of their rights and continues to impose this brutal occupation over them. The world should not be dealing with
But
Israel.
Omar,
The world should not
I
be
have to
giving
ask
Israel
you, at this point, do you really still see symmetry with that apartheid comparison? Because never under apartheid was there, a massacre of 35,000 people after decades of oppression, and it just didn't happen the same way. The brutality of this occupation is different, but do you still see the parallel there?
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of the scale of the assault on Gaza, nothing even comes close to that in recent memory. I mean, you'd have to go back all the way to Rwanda to see scale of violence that, we can start talking about something that may have been worse. But ultimately, the reality that does not, that remains the same is the need to isolate this brutal government until it recognizes Palestinians as human beings. That's really the parallel that continues to stick for sure.
Okay, Omar, that will have to be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all four of my panelists really so much for being with us. Fascinating discussion. And our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.